So it is 35 minutes after the hour for me. So I am going to go ahead and get this started. So hi, everyone. Welcome to the Biohacking Village Sandbox at RSA. Today we have 3 speakers discussing the different pandemic and peril situations and unpacking the challenges facing healthcare and biomedical security. So each person is going to have 7 minutes on the clock to do what is the fastest talk of their life, followed by 5 minutes of Q&A. And I'm going to start with Vidya. Vidya will be talking about the economics of cybersecurity, and just the fastest bio about her. Vidya Murphy is passionate about actually making change in the healthcare ecosystem and is trying to move the needle every day with her work at MedCrypt. Her talk is titled Economics of Cybersecurity, and 7 minutes on the clock. Go.
Thank you for the time, Anne. I appreciate those who are attending. So when you saw the topic of economics of security and medical devices, what first came to your mind? I'd imagine a government violation of some sort, whether it's HIPAA, whether it's GDPR, whether it's IP leaks, something like that, right? And sure, we're seeing unprecedented fines being levied. There's lawsuits pretty much across the globe in every sector of healthcare. But what I think we need to think about is that we're changing the paradigm and actually shifting how we spend our money to be more proactive with our security posture. So let's take a step back. Cyber attacks are relatively cheap and pretty easy to access. The attacker's business plan is really quite expansive, and the profit margins are quite generous. And recent studies shows that the losses as a result of these cyber attacks are in the trillions and growing in multiples every year. Now, contrast that against spend. How do we defend ourselves? Healthcare, especially, is about a generation behind in what attackers are doing. It's really hard to show a return on investment for attacks that never happen. And law enforcement is effectively non-existent. Something like 0.3% of all cybercrime that's reported is actually prosecuted. And security investment, while large, in around $100 billion, has only been growing at a rate of about 10% year over year. That doesn't really compete from a dollars and cents perspective with what our attackers have access to. Recent news of SolarWinds gives us a perfect example here. It was estimated by Microsoft that it took 1,000 engineers to have that be pulled off. Is there any organization, even in healthcare or elsewhere, that has 1,000 security engineers? It's pretty inconceivable. But this imbalance is exactly what's exacerbated. And the fact that our technology and business practices are what drive corporate growth in healthcare, and it drives innovation and profitability at the end of the day, it also undermines cybersecurity. Technologies like interoperability or cloud computing, they give us these amazing clinical advancements, but they also dramatically complicate how we can do security even. And those tasked with managing the security in devices are faced with this conundrum of really trying to balance the growth that they get from technology with the reality of potential risks that they're going to take. So what's someone attending RSAC supposed to do about this? Go back and propose to your organization that we secure everything, that the budget be unchecked and business profits be damned? I think the reality is the economics of trying to do comprehensive security are possibly limitless. So we have to ask ourselves, what happens if we do nothing? And there's several well-cited studies out there demonstrating that patient outcomes are, as a result of cybersecurity incidents, are always worse. We know that things are worse when things go wrong from a cybersecurity perspective. But the reality is that the core competency of healthcare is healthcare, whether we're coming up with new clinical treatments or enhancing data sharing across a team or novel ways for quality of life. Healthcare knows how to deliver clinical care, and it's unrealistic to expect them to become experts in cybersecurity overnight. So that's exactly the challenge. One of the things that we can think about, though, is how can we prioritize making device-based security something that is focal to healthcare? And the thought is, the buyers of medical devices have not historically pushed for this to be a core criteria in their purchasing decision. Imagine a head of surgery choosing a device that is subpar from a clinical perspective just because it's more cyber secure. That's pretty inconceivable. It would never really happen that way. And there's many devices that, as a result of this buying process, end up being reactively secure. A powerful buyer comes to the party and says, hey, we need a specific feature resolved for our specific use case. It then gets resolved by the device manufacturer who says, hey, for us to close this contract, we will do that. And the aggregate result of this is that you have a series of kind of one-off decisions that are addressing specific use cases, and there's no real cohesive strategy in place. At the end of the day, that means that these devices have a high level of security debt and most often incomplete security strategies. So how could we ever be prioritizing security when we're dealing with it in this one-off way? Now, obviously, there are some institutions that have done a lot of work and been very vocal about their progress to date. And there's several health systems out there that have been speaking about cybersecurity for a long time, have stood up labs and been really vocal about having requirements as part of their purchasing process. And that's great. And we're making good progress. But we have to critically look at ourselves today and say, has our strategy to date really worked? And are we being effective? Like all businesses, device manufacturers determine the features they build based on what their customers tell them to do. So how do we get market incentives aligned and make sure our devices are secure by design? Taking a page from a more advanced field or more regulated field, the financial sector, what do we think? Maybe the regulator should be the person. And the FDA has rapidly developed, deployed, and disseminated their pre- and post-market cybersecurity guidance. With expected enforcement coming at the end of this year, if not sooner, maybe that'll force device manufacturers to really get their cybersecurity posture into place. It calls for critical things like cryptography, behavior monitoring, and vulnerability management. And those will all make security integral to the development lifecycle. The danger I see, though, is that healthcare constantly blames the user or the patient. Whether it's patient adherence or user login management or phishing failures, this isn't an industry that's historically optimized for easing the user experience. And it goes to my earlier point, healthcare knows healthcare. So we need to secure our devices by design and make that device something that's usable from inception with how these devices operate. So you want to learn more. There's several guidance documents out there. There's the HSCC, the JSP, tons of acronyms, NCCOE, TIR 57. You can pursue any one of these, but the important thing to remember is that there is no one standard to rule them all. And we've seen idiosyncratic progress to date, but it's not sufficient. Device development has to go a systemic change about how cybersecurity can fit into every facet of development. And there's great books out there, one named Medical Device Cybersecurity for Engineers and Manufacturers, that breaks down every step of development to say what is a developer-centric strategy for having secure devices. Cybersecurity cost is only going to be effectively managed and integrated when it's part of core decision-making processes. And moreover, for an efficient economy to work, access to cybersecurity expertise is the only way to really ensure that it scales and lives throughout the lifetime of a device. But for our community, one last line on net, there's a good way we can do more, but we have to do things differently than we have in the past. Thank you.
Oh, that was the perfect segue. So what are your thoughts on doing it differently?
I think if we aren't incentivizing to be proactive, right? You can't actually keep saying, hey, we're making idiosyncratic progress and we're fixing a single implementation. We're solving specific subsets because that's an easy way to break it down, but we're not actually looking at the holistic hospital situation. We have to think about who is bearing the burden. Are the device manufacturers? Is the hospital disproportionately weighing it? What's happening?
So you didn't mention HIPAA, no high tech, none of the laws, rules, regulations, standard audits, metrics that are going on. So how are you proposing that we take lessons from FinSec into MedSec?
This is exactly where economy comes into play, right? So we talk about money because at the end of the day, these are businesses. The businesses will do what their customers ask them to do. If they keep hearing it from patients, from hospitals, from providers, from those involved in this community to demonstrate that there really is an interest in solving this, I think that moves the needle. It's the same reason IoT has failed, really, right? Like IoT has it because nobody's really advocating for your fridge to be more secure. They're not really thinking about it from what the risks are. You really have to have people that are impacted by this speaking up for it.
So what can the regulators' current state do? Because we are in the middle of a pandemic, in peril, things are happening. How do we get them to do more or better?
So I think our regulators have to be given solutions. We can't tell them, hey, here are all the problems and why we're not able to monitor our device in the field. I think we have to say, hey, here's a way to work within our complicated delivery system. And there is a technology that can make it easier. It doesn't require a person sitting there and poring over logs that they're physically going out to site to get. I think trying to solve this with human manpower is not feasible. We have to leverage the technology we have in place.
If you've ever been to any of my talks, I always have the call to action. So from your talk, from your knowledge base, from MedCrypt, what is your call to action?
I think my call to action is different depending on who you are, but at the core of it, I think understand that cybersecurity is something that, yes, we are all communally responsible for, but we can't keep blaming each other for having inadequately enabled us to be successful. Like, own your component of it, be clear about what your expectations are from whoever you're partnering with, and help that partner actually be successful. If they don't know where to start, point them in the right direction and say, we will not pursue in partnering until we see X demonstrated.
Is that contractual?
I think it can be. There's no reason why not to be, right? I mean, I'm the Wharton MBA here. Everything is driven by dollars and cents. So I think if for us to see change, there's a lot that can be done from the business side of the house.
Then that said, most hospitals work at a zero balance. How do we engage in them in an economic function to be better and to do all of these things with the resources that they have?
Coming out of the year of the pandemic, it's a very hard question to answer, right? There's going to be a lot of losses. There's going to be a lot of prioritization that's not going to be cybersecurity. But I think that if anything demonstrates even further, the hospital is not where this money needs to be spent. We've tried the hospital strategy for more than 10 years now. Have we made sufficient progress? I think there's a lot of indicators that tell us we haven't, right? So maybe that means hospitals don't need to spend more money. They need to demand more of those that they're partnering with.
So I love when people talk about business plans, and there was something else that you brought up, use cases. I am a big fan of these things, but we have 30 seconds left. So on that note, how do you propose making use of use cases in business proposals, business plans?
So I think in today's state, so I think there is a finite amount of buying that every hospital goes through. You can't say, I want to buy a new device just because you want to, but there is a plan in most cases that they will have a certain amount of spend. Be intentional with that spend. Don't go with the lowest common denominator. Expect more from your device manufacturers, and you'll probably be pleasantly surprised by options that are available from these manufacturers that don't really shift the economic spend requirement.
I love that. Thank you, Vidya. So next up, we have Mr. Caleb Barlow, and he is going to talk about the pandemic and peril of DNA data collection. And I am putting 7 minutes on the clock. Go.
Since the 5th century BC, the Hippocratic Oath has governed the relationship between patients and their physicians. Now, this oath is a promise for a doctor to uphold the art of medicine and act in their patient's best interests. But as the world has become more digital, cracks in this promise are starting to emerge. But those fissures are not with a medical procedure or a drug. They're with the investment, the care, and the approach that clinicians and medical practices make in securing patients' data, our data. You see, healthcare data is now a whole lot more than our prescriptions, ailments, and psychological history. It might now include fitness data, location data from applications, and COVID tracing data that includes information on who we associate with, not just where we've been, but who we hang out with. Now, that's got family and friends in it, but also lovers, teachers, drug dealers. It's what we call immutable data. And unlike our credit card number, if we lose our healthcare data, we cannot change it. Our medical history, whether a life-threatening allergy, a propensity for addiction, or a high risk for disease, these are things that are with us, well, for a lifetime. Now, since 2009, it's estimated that over 80% of the US population has lost their healthcare records, either lost, stolen, or impermissibly disclosed. But this gets even more interesting when we start to look at DNA sequencing data, because the bad guys aren't stealing it like they usually do. People are giving it to them freely through legitimate companies that nation states have actually invested in. Now, the first thing we've got to recognize is our DNA is unique only to you and to your identical twin. And it holds the most intimate details of the past, the present, and the future for both you personally and the people you're immediately related to. even your close relatives that aren't even born yet. Now, DNA data can be used for medical research, genealogical study, or even for determining if you're at a high risk for a life-threatening disease. Research is even underway working on things like reconstructing what a face might look like from the DNA. Now, what do you need to do it? Well, just enough DNA. But DNA can also be used for more questionable purposes, like things like targeted bioweapons. Now, this is a tough thing to rationalize, but future forms of genocide, future forms of discrimination are likely to be based on the data within your genome. Now, people freely give up their DNA for testing to understand their ancestry, lineage, and have a connection with their past or relatives they may have never met. The challenge, however, is we have no concept of who owns your DNA, who owns that scan of your face, who determines how this can and should be used. What's worse is nation-state actors are actively trying to assemble this information. They steal our healthcare records, they invest in businesses that do genomic sequencing, and there's very little regulation on what country in which this sequencing occurs or how it might be used even generations into the future. And the thing with DNA is it really can't be de-anonymized. In fact, by searching in one of any number of genealogical databases, all I need to do is find a close relative, and I can de-anonymize the data enough to identify you through a close match to one of your cousins. But it's not all stealing data. Sometimes they just buy it. FBI agent Ed Yu has been warning for years about investments that Chinese entities are making in the field of genomic sequencing. Now, China has gained significant access to Western genomic data and biological samples through research partnerships, investments, mergers and acquisitions. This includes US accreditations, work with many US hospitals, and even investment in 23andMe. Point is, if you're going to do genomic sequencing, there is a very good chance that the equipment, the laboratory, or the foundational research or the companies involved have a Chinese nexus. So let me give you a bit of a case study. BGI Genomics. Now, BGI is the Chinese genomic sequencing powerhouse. They were offering COVID-19 testing capabilities globally. They sold or gave away 35 million rapid COVID-19 testing kits that were sold in 180 countries. They even built 58 COVID testing laboratories in 18 countries. But in addition to the tests and laboratories, they were also requesting that researchers using their equipment send the data generated on their equipment, as well as the patient samples, so they could be sequenced and shared in China's government-funded National Gene Bank. Now, for storing this data, BGI had a partnership with a company you may have heard of before, Huawei. So this data was then stored in a Huawei cloud. Again, this is legitimate above-board work, but it does raise some questions, including even a warning in February 2020 from the National Counterintelligence and Security Center, which resulted in a whole flurry of media reports, including coverage in Reuters, 60 Minutes, The Hill, and many others. So my point here is we need to think differently. The security posture of your private data is as important as your pulse, your cholesterol level, and your weight. And it's time for medical practitioners to start to realize this. More than anyone else, we trust our doctors for advice, for diagnosis, for our health. We're at the point where a bad password policy, poor storage of our genomic history, can have an as adverse of an effect and impact on our lives as, let's say, living with high cholesterol. We must treat patient data differently. It's part of your health. And if your data isn't healthy, you are not healthy. Thank you. I'm Caleb Barlow from Synergistic.
I am so ready for this because this is legit so much of my talk. So I have notes. You talked about the Hippocratic Oath, and there's a paper out there. It was started by a couple of the folks from the I Am the Cavalry, and one of the last lines on there is my quote of, "But shouldn't the hospitals also have to take the Hippocratic Oath for hospitals?" And then at the Biohacking Village, one of the things that we do at the Device Lab is we have a Hippocratic Oath for hackers, where if they find something, they automatically have to report it back. So do you have any thoughts feelings about that so far?
Well, I mean, here's two things to keep in mind, right? It's not that hospitals aren't investing in security. They are. They're just not investing fast enough. In fact, 66% of America's hospitals cannot meet a level 3 on a NIST score. That is utterly unacceptable, right? 66%. So they have the data, they're highly vulnerable, and the investments need to catch up with where the bad guys are.
So the other thing that I postulate constantly is who owns the data if you go into the hospital? If I take a blood test, that blood is technically still mine, but it is in the possession of the hospital. So
but the data isn't necessarily yours. And in fact, if you know, a lot of folks may not be aware of a concept called interoperability. Now, remember, one of the aspects in HIPAA is portability. Now, portability in this case, originally meant, portability between insurance carriers, but you can actually request now access to patients' healthcare records for doing research. And the healthcare institutions cannot deny that access for data unless there are legitimate reasons to deny it for the purposes of research. Or let's say I've got a fitness app that I want to connect to my healthcare record. They pretty much have to allow that nowadays, except for a very small list of criteria in which they can deny it. So the problem here is, because of the desire to help the public good, because of the desire to make healthcare electronic, what we've done inadvertently is we've made it easier for bad guys to get access to this data. Frankly, I'm just waiting for a bad guy to go set up a research institution and request access through the interoperability standards. Why steal it?
So being with that said, do you have any feelings about FIRE? Because I have other questions about asymmetric warfare for you.
Do I have any questions about what?
Do you have any feelings about FIRE, FHIR, the interoperability next standard?
I actually don't at this point. It's so early on that I think we're all kind of looking at where is this going, and more importantly, getting our arms around what's already legislated.
Right. So you were talking about targeted parts of healthcare before, and I've been in the military and I do government stuff. So I consider healthcare to be an asymmetric piece of warfare. And there's a lot of pushback on that whenever I have those conversations, because there's so much belief that warfare should only be kinetic, where right now we are in the middle of the warfare because of healthcare. So what are your thoughts on the Hippocratic?
Well, I'll actually take it a step further. I think if you look at what's going on in America's hospitals right now, it is the bridge between cyber and kinetic warfare, in that when, in November of last year, a dozen hospitals went down after there was, an attempted takedown of the TrickBot botnet. Now, I don't know if that was retaliatory or not, but the timing sure as hell looks like it was, right? The fact that an adversary can knowingly, with intent to not just take down a hospital, but take down entire systems, I don't know what else you call that if not kinetic warfare. Now, the difference in this case, though, is your adversary, we view them as criminals, as ransomware operators, because they're, they may be state associated, but we need a new definition of who these folks are, because they're not traditional criminals if we can't bring them to court and law enforcement. They're also not traditional terrorists, but there's something in between. And we've got to think about a new definition and an associated proportional response.
I love that. And I think they're actually working on something very similar in that vein. I have 10 seconds left with you. What is your call to action?
Look, my call to action at the end of the day, get a security assessment and start to actually go beyond it and validate your security posture if you're in healthcare. Because if you're not keeping up with the bad guys, you're falling behind, and now it can have a kinetic impact on your organization and your ability to treat patients.
Perfect. And I'm going to segue this perfectly because you talked about disinformation a little bit, and Sharka is going to talk about disinformation, misinformation, and disinformation in the times of the pandemic. So Sharka, 7 minutes on the clock, go.
Okay, so I come from sort of social engineering background, but misinformation, disinformation is something that I've been speaking about a lot because it's actually something that has a huge impact and it could save life if you want to see it from that perspective. So I will now tell you about the infodemic. What is infodemic? It's actually been defined by World Health Organization as an overabundance of information, some accurate, some not. That makes it harder for people to find trustworthy sources and reliable guidance when needed. I think it's important here to mention what the difference between disinformation and misinformation. Disinformation is on purpose, wrong, incorrect information, while misinformation is unwittingly, let's say, shared information without, that's the differences in intent, right? So here where we are right now, or what is it that we can actually see? This is actually a research that was done. So there was a research that was published by the American Journal of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene that said that in the first 3 months of the pandemic, at least 800 people may have died around the world because of the coronavirus related misinformation. Let that sink. And that's only first 3 months. And obviously that was only specific misinformation campaigns that were followed. Another case where what we are actually seeing, it's all these that were injured, hospitalized, or actually died as a result of raising racist and xenophobic violence and discrimination linked to the coronavirus misinformation and disinformation. Again, this is something that is, it's so you could see that so clearly in the world, and it's linked to the wrong and incorrect information that being shared either intentionally or not. So what is it that we can do? Let's flatten the infodemic curve. And what I mean by that, there are simple, there are at least 7 steps from what the World Health Organization is saying. So assess the source. You need to understand, where does it come from? Are you the person that is trying to share some piece of information? Do you know who is the person that you're sharing it from? Who is the person that, how well do you know them? What's their maybe a history of sharing other pieces of information? The second one is go beyond the headline. Actually, sometimes going through the actual article makes you understand a little bit better, because a lot of articles are written in a way for you to have a reaction, for you to, a lot of people are sharing just for the likes, and that can be dangerous and not only in a pandemic, obviously. Identify the author. Have a look. Is the author a renowned journalist? Is that person actually sharing their sources? Are they linking to another research? That all could tell you or point you towards it being perhaps incorrect information. Check the data. So again, that's going to the resources and the authors and all the research that's been done around this specific topic. Do you feel like the information that's being represented was well researched and there are actual data? Date is another part of this. We've been seeing this with images. So sometimes some journalists are putting images that are not relevant to the actual piece of information. So that's another part. Examine the supporting evidence. So again, is perhaps is the medium where you're reading it from or you're trying to share, is their affiliation perhaps political to certain side? Well, you need to understand, where is this coming from when it's trying to inform you about something in a certain way. Check your biases. This is a little bit tricky, obviously, because we need to look at ourselves and how we think and what might be some of the things or actions that we are doing. But what's the better time to do it than now, when it could actually save lives? Then the last one is turn to fact checkers. So there are, I think that we are seeing it more and more on social media, but there are actually specific websites where you can go to check facts. You can actually, if you find, let's say you're on a Facebook and you find that this article is not correct, you can report it. So you can do your little bit of flattening the infodemic. And how it looks like. Here you can actually see this is sort of a good representation. So let's say first is a group chat. That one person maybe was not part of the group chat or didn't decided that it's perhaps just a rumor. So then we go to the next part where people are actually looking at sources and decide that it's not trustworthy source. The other person checked some of the facts. Then it could be someone who just asked themselves, how do you know that it's true? And it's sort of cascading this way into, in the end, flattening the infodemic curve, hopefully. And that is me. I finished ahead of time.
You have 40 seconds. Do you want to say anything else?
I think that was short and sweet and said everything that it needed. Hit me with your questions.
Okay. So how can healthcare stay ahead of the misinformation? The pandemic has shown the lack of trust and or understanding of science. So how do we get back to that place of having a normalized conversation about all of these things?
So one thing is the fact that you're mentioning the trust. I would say that we need to teach actually people not to blindly trust and recognize that maybe everything, that's what I teach in the social engineering, right? Everything that you're seeing or hearing, it's perhaps not the reality. It's let people start to think outside the box. So what they are hearing and seeing, it's perhaps something that they need to think about. There was actually a study that was asking people if they think that the headline is accurate for the article itself. And people were 3 times more likely to spot misinformation if they were asked this question. So it's to teach people how to think outside the box and maybe lose the trust, but build the trust in themselves and their own judgment.
So how can the healthcare industry itself better influence media and the messages that are going out there?
So I think it's infodemic is as the pandemic. So we need to treat it as such. So we need to understand the virus, how to treat it. I think part of it would be to I think it's what we are trying to do at Biohacking Village, right? To have the hackers work hand in hand with healthcare and medical device makers. But it's also use more of tools such as, I'm a big fan of Benford's law, which is sort of anomaly detection. So there is so much of how we can detect misinformation, because a lot of it, in order to spread really fast, is just bots. And this is quite easily done by, for example, the Benford's law. So, and then obviously there has to be a regulation of all of this, and that goes into laws and regulations. And I think people should be held accountable. So are you a doctor that's spreading misinformation? You should be held accountable for this. But it goes also back to, I think that what you and Caleb mentioned is Tallinn manual. So more of a going back to it, that goes back to cyber warfare. But this, I am sort of missing the healthcare part of it. And while we are quite far away from it being implemented, I think it's what we've seen during the pandemic is a scary scenario that didn't go too bad, but we should be thinking ahead of time.
So how do we create better adaptability for both the healthcare industry and for the patients that are in the industry?
Adaptability to what?
To better understanding the message and better being able to pivot easier off of, I know this isn't right, I know this isn't real, I can move away from it.
So I think it's partially who are the people that are most vulnerable. It would be people that are older, that are usually lacking the social media literacy. So it's teaching them because, and they are also those that will ended up being probably perhaps victims. So it's social media literacy together with health literacy, which is the capacity to obtain, process, and understand some basic healthcare information for you to take the right decision about your own health.
So we have about 3 minutes left. I'm going to leave it open for you three. Do any of you have questions for each other or final thoughts? Actually, before I do that, what's your call to action, Sharka?
My call to action is, are you someone, a lawmaker? Reach out to Biohacking Village. Let's work it out. Let's work at all those laws and regulations. Are you a person that is just observing everything like me? You need to talk to everyone around you. I speak to my family and I speak to my loved ones and my friends, and it's sometimes exhausting because we are not seeing that much of a difference. But take time, be patient, and start explaining to the people around you, and karma is going to reward you. I surely believe in that.
I love statistics. So I'm going to throw one thing down. The generations that we are building for are primarily current state, the baby boomers. So the greatest, I think they're called greater generation that came before them, and then the baby boomers, and then Gen X and Z, and millennials, and everybody else in there. And the great generation and the baby boomers are, I believe, going to be about 43% of the population in the United States. So when we build for technology and security and privacy and all of the new cool things that are coming out, we have to take into account that they may not be our main person that we are producing for, but they may be people that are taking advantage of it because I want to see if my mother falls or how her heart rate is or how my father is doing whatever he's doing. So I might give them something to hold on to so that I can monitor them. So there's that huge disparity of people that did not grow up with technology versus the generations that are coming that have the iPads and phones in their hands. So are there any final thoughts or any words that you folks would like to bestow upon the listeners?
The only thing I'd add to that is it's always going to be, we're designing for the folks that aren't as tech savvy. It's going to continue, right? This is going to be future generations. So we need to not solve it by trying to have these one-off conversations. I'm not saying there's not utility there, but we have to systemically change things. Otherwise, it's never going to actually reach scale.
I feel like Caleb has something. I can see it happening. What is
Well,
that?
I mean, I think at the end of the day, what we've really got to do is we've got to recognize that healthcare is under attack right now from a variety of different sources. It is an industry hasn't traditionally had the technical sophistication to deal with it. And we've really got to rally around this because at the end of the day, we all lose when healthcare gets hacked.
I want to add something to that. I think a lot of folks don't recognize how much of the other parts of industry are embedded in healthcare, because it's not just healthcare, it's all of the things. Sharka.
Yeah, that plays into the article that I wrote just last week about industrial control systems in healthcare. So I believe, as you're saying, it's a huge ecosystem that goes, and it's obviously not only industrial control systems, but it's a payment systems. It's everything, and it's humans, it's technology, and it's so complex where we need to work together. And that seems to have been an issue all along. So I think that we need to be better at joining hands and talking to each other and not treat issues separately.
The other thing I would throw in here is don't
30
forget
seconds.
healthcare is over 17% of the US gross domestic product, right? I mean, forget about just the data. This is our economy at the end of the day. We have to protect it.
I love that. That's where we're gonna end it. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you for speaking. I feel like we should do this more often as fireside chats between all of us.
Thank you.
Thank you.